Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this session, and thanks the Optiv team for having us here. It's a great partnership with Optiv, and I do appreciate all the efforts that you do to educate the community and bringing everyone together under this the context of the conference and to further push educational content through the technical audience. On my side, I'm JP, CTO and one of the founders of Onapsis. I've been doing cybersecurity for ERP applications, research, penetration testing, and different very technical focused areas for the past 15 years or more. But I'm not here by myself today. I'm here with one of the experts of the Onapsis Research Labs. Ignacio, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Ignacio. I'm part of the security research team in Onapsis for the past 2 years, and I performed several tasks in here like bug hunting and pen test and delivering trainings about SAP security. So I will let JP continue with the presentation now.
Thank you, Ignacio. Yes, he's one of our experts in around trainings and vulnerabilities and pen testing. So I'm happy that he's joining us in this session. He's gonna give you some quite cool demos and show you a couple of examples of different risks and vulnerabilities in SAP applications. So we have a lot of content for today. So let's we better get into it. We're gonna cover some of the threat intelligence landscape, the evolution of it, the most relevant highlights. We're going to talk about very technical vulnerabilities on SAP applications and some of the issues that the Onapsis Research Labs, including Ignacio, have been reporting to SAP over the past years. And we're going to wrap up with the activities that we are seeing in the wild in terms of cyber threat actors targeting SAP applications and some recommendations in terms of what to do or how to prevent these type of threats. Before getting into the threat landscape and the context, I wanted to touch base on the genesis of all this research and who is the team behind this, what we call the Onapsis Research Labs, which is the leading threat research on business critical applications on SAP and Oracle applications with specifically, but in general, many different technologies and applications. We have reported hundreds of different vulnerabilities to vendors. We have been actively collaborating with certs and organizations to raise awareness and generate alerts around ongoing activities, threats, vulnerabilities on ERP applications. Of course, presenting in conferences and really just highlighting some of the most relevant parts. 1 out of 3 critical vulnerabilities in the last 5 years was discovered in SAP, were discovered by the Onapsis Research Labs. So a lot of thought leadership and a lot of knowledge around SAP technologies. A lot of those were discovered by Ignacio and reported by Ignacio too, but this is really a large group of researchers, very, very knowledgeable on the topic. Thinking about the vulnerabilities specifically in one of the most relevant and important technologies of SAP, which is called SAP HANA, the in-memory database, the stats are even more impressive. 60% of the patched vulnerabilities in SAP HANA, the vulnerabilities that were fixed through a security note in SAP HANA were reported by the Onapsis Research Labs. So I think that speaks by those numbers speaks by themselves, and really, I'm really proud of this team and what's been able to achieve over the past couple of years. So in terms of context, we have been working on cybersecurity for ERP applications for quite a long time already, and always reporting vulnerabilities, working with customers, doing penetration tests, doing assessments, and really helping organizations secure their business critical applications. But in order to understand the need for securing these applications, it's important to understand the context. What's happening, right? Well, we always talk about vulnerabilities and we always talk about risk, but risk is built on top of two components: probability times impact. Now, sorry, thinking about SAP applications or ERP applications in general, well, no one would argue about the impact. Vulnerability exploited in one of these productive systems, downtime in one of these business processes, the lack of ability to operate from a business process perspective, or even the data breach in one of these supercritical business databases could become a significant risk, right? And it's a significant impact to pretty much every organization that is running ERP applications. So impact has always been high. However, when we talk about probability, well, that's a component that we want to address today as well as part of the content, is really talk about why do organizations need to address cybersecurity for ERP applications, and what are threat actors actively doing about this. But it's not just because of the research that we identified. With IDC, some time ago, we did a survey. As part of the outcome of that survey, some quite interesting data points came out. One of them being that 64% of the respondents said that their ERP applications suffered a breach or an incident in the last up to 24 months. So that was definitely an eye-opener in terms of how organizations are perceiving the risk and data breaches in their own ERP applications. A lot of those don't make the headlines, don't go out to the press and are contained, but there is activity, there is threat activity that's ongoing, and we're gonna get into the details of that. Historically, it's been an evolution, right? It's been a threat landscape that has been evolving since the very first vulnerabilities and patches released by SAP in 2006, 2007, 2008, all the way to today, where we have thousands and thousands of different deployments of ERP applications, SAP technology running with different versions, different interfaces, hybrid environments, talking to a cloud, on-premise, in a multi-cloud environment. So what does it mean in terms of the threat landscape? How has it been evolving? Well, in this section, what we wanted to do is really capture or highlight the most relevant milestones in terms of cybersecurity for ERP applications, which speak about critical vulnerabilities, open compromises, or publicly available information about incidents, as well as alerts and notifications from cybersecurity organizations such as CERTs or the CISA organization. We have been working together as part of the research labs with different CERTs, alerting organizations when different type of risks and vulnerabilities were becoming not only known to the public, but also being exploited in the wild. And what is the motivation? What are we trying to achieve here? Why are we talking about SAP attacks? Why are we talking about threat actors targeting ERP applications? Well, again, we have been doing this for quite a long time. We have been taking part of incident responses, helping organizations that have been compromised, getting back on track, helping them set up their processes and their technology in a way that they can react and really control the risks to ERP applications. But that information is not something that we can openly share, right? It's some of the most confidential information that we work with organizations. But we know that those things are happening, and we wanted to be able to capture data points that are actionable and that can help organizations understand that there is an ongoing risk and what they can do about it. and being able to address questions such as who's attacking SAP applications, what are the IOCs, what are the TTPs, what are they looking for, but more importantly, help organizations understand how can we stop these threats or these threat actors going against mission critical applications. So in this next section, Ignacio is gonna describe some of the vulnerabilities affecting SAP applications, not everything and anything. He's gonna be very focused on a specific subset of vulnerabilities that are very critical, were reported by the Onapsis Research Labs to SAP and were patched appropriately. After that, he's gonna give some examples of what we have seen in the wild, but then we are gonna get into details of what we also see in terms of how these vulnerabilities are being exploited and how these are being combined, are used to compromise SAP applications. So Ignacio, back to you.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. So on the last Black Hat USA edition, Onapsis provided some demos about a highly critical and authenticated endpoint on the solution manager that allows an attacker to compromise the entire SAP landscape. And not just that, but also the underlying infrastructure, being able to perform some lateral movement and privilege escalation. Furthermore, a public exploit was released in January of this year, increasing the risk of being exploited. This is highly related of what JP said before about the probability times the impact of an exploit. So this was presented, as I said, in the last Black Hat USA edition by Pablo and Ivan. And here we have a typical SAP system deployment architecture. Usually, SAP administrator will access to the solution manager, or we just call it SolMan, to carry out several tasks. For example, apply patches or do some general configuration in the entire landscape of SAP. Every satellite host has an agent that is connected and exchange information with the SolMan. Through this agent, the solution manager is able to perform tasks and monitoring to any connected host. Among others, SolMan provides an utility or an application that is called EEM that allows to execute a script on any connected agent. The final goal of this application is emulate a user action on the target system. So, Onapsis researchers found that EEM endpoint was unauthenticated. So it is easy to imagine the following scenario. An attacker with direct access to the solution manager could force a couple of requests on it, and executing an arbitrary OS command could be able to gain access to every satellite agent connected to the solution manager, and of course, to the solution manager in itself. Furthermore, abusing other non-public but patched vulnerabilities is not only possible to gain access to SAP administration, but also root access on the underlying operating system. As we can see, several patch notes was released and should be applied to correct the EEM-related vulnerabilities. Complementing the aforementioned scenario, in SAP world, all the systems are tightly coupled, providing several interconnection features and components that allows to interact among them and also with external systems. Together with some well-known misconfiguration, we have a lot of possibilities to perform lateral movement once we gain access to any system on the landscape and not just to the solution manager. Here we have, for instance, the SAP gateway, that if the ACL allows it, and the port is exposed of this component, could lead to full system compromise. Also, we have the SAP message server that could lead to a bypass to maybe a well-configured ACL on the gateway, but we can be a part of the trust relationship in SAP world and bypass this control of the ACL in the gateway and leading again to a full SAP system compromise. So, of course, and also to the operating system that hosts this SAP system. SAP has a lot of standard passwords that should be modified by default, can be exploited to gain access to the SAP system. And we have a lot of evidence that are being exploited in the wild. So several attackers have tested for standard password on every SAP system that is exposed to internet. Also, we have all hashes that is easy to crack with some tools and gain maybe some historical password that an SAP administration could assign to a user or a user has, and we can detect, for example, patterns of password. If we would, of course, we need to gain access to the database first, but could lead us to gain access to other SAP system in the landscape. And finally, but not least, we have several kind of RFC destination, which is a solution in SAP world for remote function calls. So to summarize this, SAP is a huge piece of software with a lot of interconnected and highly related components, and along with public and open source exploits, the attack surface is large enough to give any malicious actor several possible entry points that could lead to compromise not just the SAP system.
Yeah, Ignacio, if I may comment there, great summary. I think, as you mentioned, this really speaks about the complexity of these applications. And it's not just about SAP. I think in general, when we talk about ERP applications, we're talking about applications that are supporting very complex and heavily integrated business processes. So the technology that supports these applications is complex as well. And it's not just about vulnerabilities, like in software vulnerabilities, the SolMan vulnerabilities that were patched by SAP and reported by Onapsis, or the RECON vulnerability, we'll touch base on that later, or any other vulnerability, as in you apply a patch and the vulnerability is patched. Well, the complexity of this technology opens up a lot of different areas of potential risk. Now, it really depends on how you maintain, operate, deploy SAP applications to understand if you could be vulnerable to this or not. But in the end, I think what's important to understand is that there are a lot of different areas which attackers could abuse to compromise these applications, not just CVEs, also misconfigurations and other concepts. And some of those are actually being used and are being actively exploited. So what we wanted to highlight here is that complexity aspect of this, and really the Onapsis Research Labs is continuously doing penetration tests and assessments of applications, and they are always looking at these different, let's say, combinations of things that are very, very similar to the combinations of vulnerabilities and risks that we see happening in the wild.
So now I will show you a couple of demos. I will start first with the video that was presented during the last Black Hat edition. And after I will show a couple of live demos of some attacks and options to perform lateral movement. First, here we have the video. Here an attacker is performing the EEM attack that we have explained in the previous slides. Here we can see first connecting to the solution manager, listing all the agents that is assigned to this solution manager, and targeting and launching an attack on every agent that is on that list. Also, we can see that we have several flavors of operating system with different version of Java, and here we have a Linux system, a Windows system. And as we can see in the left side of the screen, the attacker is executing operating system commands like who am I and host name, showing us the great power of this vulnerability. Also, it's possible to gain access as root or as a system in the case of Windows, of course, abusing other vulnerabilities, not just that. Here we have Shodan, a public and well-known internet index. And here I will search, for example, for an HTML content in a publicly exposed, a very well-known SAP message. And here we have a lot of examples of SAP directly exposed to internet. I hope that no of your companies here. Sorry if I'm showing some names, but anyone with access to Shodan could be able to perform this kind of search. Here we have an SAP Java implementation mostly, but also we can search, for example, for another component that could lead us to gain access to the underlying infrastructure or system behind it, which is known as SAP router, which is more or less a router for SAP services. For example, here we have a lot of more results of this specific component that also with the misconfiguration can give us access not just to an SAP system, but also we can perform, for example, port scanning in the internal network or forward some other kind of services behind this SAP router.
Yeah, so just to understand the power of this is there are services that are well known that are continuously indexing the internet, and these type of services are also being used not only to understand exposure to the internet from corporations, but also are being used by people who wants to actively look for these type of technologies on the internet. So Ignacio showed just one or two examples, one on the SAP router and one on the HTTP technology, but there are different ways of looking at these services. And as you can see, there are thousands of different exposed SAP technology related services that can be an entry point to start interfacing with these applications. And thinking about the complexity again, potentially misconfigurations, potentially CVEs that can be leveraged against these type of applications. Now, we don't know how many of these could be vulnerable or exposed or insecure, but we know that there are thousands of these connected to internet and really reachable from anywhere.
And also, we can, for example, search, do a simple search in Google. For example, for this case, this is a well-known URL of SAP also, and as we can see, we have a lot of SAP portals exposed and already indexed in Google. So it's kind of easy to spot SAP system connected directly to internet. As JP said, not only non-patch vulnerabilities, but also misconfiguration could lead us to exploit the SAP system and gain access to everything. So besides the search for internet exposed system, I will show you a straightforward example of an attack. Here we have our victim system, and I will show you, for example, here I have my attacker platform. I have some examples here. I will test these credentials to show you that this user doesn't exist in the system right now. So I will try to log in. I will copy the password, pass here. The user doesn't exist. But now, of course, the system isn't patched yet, but I will try to exploit this well-known vulnerability, which is called RECON, and was very famous and published by the DHS also, to create this account. Sorry, this is not the password. Here we have the password. So this is one of the publicly available exploit and open source. So it's really easy for an attacker to just not only to spot publicly available systems, but also this exploit and download it and just execute it. And it's pretty simple to create our new admin user in that system. So now I will do the same process again to try to log in. Okay, the user is here. I will copy the password again. And now I'm in. So from here, now it's possible, for example, to execute operating system commands and maybe leverage the tightly coupled relation between SAP system and gain access to any other system, or maybe, for example, forward my request to this system to some other line system. And from here, I can access, for example, to the solution manager and exploit the aforementioned vulnerability, leading to us to gain access to the entire landscape and root access to every system also. So now I will show you, just as an example, some easy ways to understand how easy for an attacker is to access to maybe other systems in the landscape. Here I have, for example, another kind of connection to the SAP system, which is maybe its most common connection. Here I have a user that I created before, of course, but I imagine that this could be created from this other system to simplify this operation. Well, I will log in on this system first. Okay, as you can see, the name of the system is on the top of the window. I'm in the ATO system. But as we said, we have a really well-known remote function call, which is RFC destination and RFC callbacks and a lot of options inside the RFC world. And here we have some pre-configured, of course, RFC destination to other systems. And this is a really common configuration, and in our experience, we found a lot of SAP system with RFC destination to other, because several needs inside the company, maybe to simplify the operation of any user or to perform some task from one system to another, because SAP manage a lot of features, for example, HR data or any other kind of component that SAP provide. So here, for example, as I said, I am in ATO, and with this forged RFC destination that maybe a technical user has created before, I can double click here. Is not a really good practice, but it is useful to find this kind of RFC destination with users with pre-saved credentials, and gain access with remote login to other system. Now I'm in AT1. So it was pretty straightforward to perform a lateral movement. And this is a really common misconfiguration, or maybe not so secure configuration in some SAP system. Of course, I need a highly privileged user to access to this kind of transaction code, but it's a chance that if I gain access to the first system to move to another. Another option that I have here, for example, SAP needs to connect and access to some other components, like it could be a database or another system or the agents in itself, and has a technology which is called secure storage file system. And here I have an example of some file. These files are encrypted, as we can see here. I'll show you a little bit more of this. So it's not possible to see or to spot the password, for example, in this kind of configuration. SAP provide this kind of feature because to avoid user interaction, for example, to connect to the database anytime the SAP system reboot, for example. So, but it's possible to do something like this with these files. I can provide, for example, the key and the data file. And as you can see, it's very easy to spot here. The password is stored in this encrypted file. So with this gain access to the underlying operating system, I can get access to this file, decrypt it, and afterwards access to maybe to the database or to another system or anything. Maybe we have a password utilization, for example. So that's all on my side with the live demos. Maybe I will show you just one last thing I was missing. Maybe from people from the outside of the SAP world, but it's possible once we have access to an SAP system, for example, to execute OS commands as easy like this. And as I showed, I'm now in 80.0, but also I'm in 81, and I can perform the same function call or report call to execute operating systems.
Excellent. Thanks, Ignacio. Great demo. I really enjoyed all the demos that you provided. And just to recap on what we saw before we continue with the content, basically, Ignacio showed different ways of really interfacing with SAP applications in a way that the system can be abused to move from one type of privileges to a different type of privileges, like a privilege escalation or lateral movement, moving from one system to a different system. There are many different ways of achieving this in terms of how the system is set up and configured. It really depends on how the system is maintained. But because of the complexity of this type of technologies, these type of things are possible. But more important is to understand that these risks are possible and how do we address them and how do we set up the right controls around it. So let's get back into the slides. So Ignacio went through all of these sections. He talked about the presentation at Black Hat, the vulnerabilities, all the patches. Think about this, each one of these as one vulnerability that was patched by SAP. So all of these were, or most of these were reported by the Onapsis, and then wrapping up with different ways of really interfacing with the systems. So why did we do this vulnerabilities demonstration? Again, we want to show you the complexity aspect of SAP security and SAP cybersecurity, just so you have an understanding of what's happening in the outside world. And that's where I'll continue now. I wanted to touch base on a research that we released a few weeks ago together with SAP. We basically set up a network, a threat intelligence network, to be able to identify and capture IOCs and threat activity to understand what are threat actors doing when they get in touch with SAP applications. Just as we saw Ignacio showing you the different type of vulnerabilities and risks from a more of a research perspective and from a pen testing perspective, well, very, very similar things are happening on the real life, right? On systems that are potentially accessible by threat actors are executing very similar things. So what we saw over the past couple of months in our threat intelligence network is over 300 confirmed exploitations of SAP-specific vulnerabilities. Over 100 of them, when after the system was exploited, after users were created, humans were actively connecting to the system, accessing data, traversing the different sections, and doing things on the system. We're getting to what things they did, but really connecting to the system and interfacing with the SAP application. We tracked over 7 threat vectors, and that means CVEs and CWEs coming from 18 unique countries. Now that's really subjective because they use also Tor nodes and VPCs and other technologies. So one attacker, for example, came from 5 different countries and a number of different IPs for different phases, but it's still a good data point to understand the spread of this. Now, for all the technical details of this, I encourage you to take a look at the report. You can download from the Onapsis webpage. It has all the IOCs, all the TTPs, and all the technical details of what we have been able to observe. I'm going to do a highlight here, but really, if you want to get more details, I encourage you to take a look at the report. The other data point that I think is super important, and I think this is probably one of the most relevant highlights of the report, is that these technologies, SAP technologies, are becoming much more similar to any traditional IT technology that our company is running. For example, Windows applications. In the past, organizations were fine with running years old patches in production and operating their systems with significant risk on their ERP applications. But we see that those times are shrinking and threat actors are very fast to react in terms of creating exploits for vulnerabilities that are being patched by the vendor, as well as actively exploiting and compromising systems after the system was put online. So we have a lot of different data points on these two. Of course, these are worst cases, right? It was as bad as 72 hours, as bad as less than 3 hours. For example, the KPI of exposure to compromise, the mean of that was, I think, 6.5 days, and the maximum was around 3 weeks. But it was as bad as 3 hours. So it's important to understand that really there's a fast pace from threat actors to react and automate and compromise these applications. So it's important to be to have the right controls and the right programs in place for that. And going back to the technical parts and attacks, this is one of the threats that we observed on the threat intelligence network. Well, Ignacio talked about the different vulnerabilities, talked about the different examples of not only RECON, as you saw a demo, but also he talked about misconfigurations. Well, one of those ones that Ignacio showed is actively being weaponized and really leveraged to compromise SAP applications. This is the CBSS 10 vulnerability, CB 2020-6287. The interesting part was that we even saw systems being patched after the system was compromised. That speaks about the level of knowledge that some of these threat actors have around SAP technology, right? In some cases, we saw threat actors that were going with a very, very specific laser focus on specific sections, accessing very specific sections and information of the systems, speaking about the level of knowledge around this technology that threat actors do possess. So I think the RECON vulnerability is definitely an interesting example of the threat activity that we are observing. The second one, which I think is even more interesting, is another vulnerability, one of the vulnerabilities that Ignacio briefly talked about and showed you in a video. This vulnerability, CB 2020-6207, SolMan vulnerability, reported to Onapsis, by Onapsis to SAP, and patched by SAP very quickly in 2020, early 2020. Now, there wasn't a publicly available exploit up until January this year, as Ignacio mentioned. However, even though the active exploitation really peaked after the release of the publicly available exploit, if we look at the historical activity, we saw activity around this vulnerability before the public release, around 2020 in October and November. So that speaks about the concept of, yes, publicly available exploits are bad in terms of risk, right? If there's a publicly available exploit, this is something that could be leveraged very quickly against our systems. However, the vulnerability in itself is already the risk, right? When the vulnerability is patched, we need to make sure that we have the process in place, because even if there is not a publicly available exploit, there could be someone with the right intent and the right resources to build an exploit for that, as it showed this example. So the SolMan vulnerability or the SolMan vulnerabilities, which is a set of critical vulnerabilities patched by SAP in 2020, are definitely worth taking a look at and keeping an eye on in terms of the criticality and the threat activity. The third one is something really not complex, not fancy. We are talking about brute forcing, and Ignacio showed you, briefly discussed a little bit of this as well. There are different standard users, there are different high privileged users with default passwords or weak passwords in SAP applications, depending on how you deployed the system, how you operated the system, how the system was migrated from one version to the other. Different factors or different situations weigh in or factor into this risk, but this is possible, and we are continuously seeing threat actors trying to compromise SAP applications by things as simple as brute forcing some of these default and high privilege accounts. Now, so it's not just about CBEs. It's also about CWEs and configurations and the techniques that we have been seeing and that Ignacio even showed you practically. The other aspect of the research that we released is about the combination of vulnerabilities. As going back to the point of complexity, the ultimate goal of these threat actors, someone who is targeting SAP applications, is to compromise SAP data. However, in order to do that, sometimes there needs to be privilege escalation, lateral movement, and further compromise along the way. So in order to achieve that, threat actors are combining or using different vulnerabilities in different capacities. But yeah, for me, the outcome of this is threat actors are using everything and anything they possess and they know to be able to compromise these applications and ultimately get into data. In terms of what are the vulnerabilities that were observed and identified, well, you have here the summary. In the threat report, you have the summary as well with some additional data. I think this is also important from an actionability perspective. If you want to take a look at the details of the patch that fixes the vulnerability, if there are workarounds, if there are any ways of mitigating those vulnerabilities, this is a good place to go. SAP has a lot of documentation on the SAP Launchpad and in the help site, help.sap.com as well. So I encourage you to take a look at those sites as well, because those are very well documented and provides a lot of insights and links to other sources as well. In terms of the activity that we observed, I mentioned to you a couple of the examples of the threat vectors, right? We talked about CVE 2020-6287, talked about CVE 2020-6207, and the brute forcing. Those are three examples of the ways or the risks that are being leveraged by these threat actors. However, in terms of this life cycle, that just accounts to one phase of this. What we observed is really three different, very well differentiated phases. The first, starting with automated scanning, continuous proofs of different type of vulnerabilities around SAP technology to be able to identify, are these systems vulnerable? Are these systems subject to these type of risks and vulnerabilities? After that, once one of these vulnerabilities is identified, we see automated exploitation and manual as well. We have seen also manual, but both are happening. And that's really to compromise the system and get the initial access. And then after that, we saw really the system being accessed, hands on keyboard, log into the system with someone, with a human behind that, really providing credentials, logging into the system, accessing different sections. In some cases, going to very, very specific sections of the SAP application. In some other cases, going through different data, exfiltrating data, downloading and accessing data from the system. So what you see in the right side are really the outcomes that we have seen. This is part coming from the threat intelligence network and part coming from the incident responses that we have been working on. If we want to group the outcome of this, is typically one of these three: financial fraud, basically modifying, extracting data to perform some type of fraud scenario, exfiltrating data, downloading data from the SAP systems, and disruption of SAP-based processes. That means that, like, stopping the operations that are being supported by this technology. So those are the main three scenarios that we can categorize these examples. So what does it mean to you and to organizations? In terms of takeaways and implications, well, threat actors are actively targeting and exploiting these type of applications. It's not something that is foreign to threat actors. The technology is not unknown. The TPPs are not unknown. So they possess the capabilities, the resources, and the ability to perform direct compromise of SAP applications. So it's no longer a question of an if. It's no longer a question of would this happen? It's really, this is happening. Threat actors are leveraging SAP capabilities or SAP knowledge to be able to compromise those applications with the ultimate goal of accessing that data. The window is shortening. We are no longer talking about systems that are that are okay to be running with years old patches. We see continuous activity, in most cases automated activity, trying to identify, exploit, and compromise SAP applications that are not secure. So if it's a missing patch, like a well-known CVE, or if it's a misconfiguration, or even as simple as a weak password, that's going to be used against the SAP application to be able to be targeted. I touch base on this a little bit, but it's not just CVEs. It's not just software vulnerabilities. We are really talking about problems at the application level, at anything and everything that is a risk in SAP applications is going to be used. And finally, because of the nature of these type of applications, we are not just talking about a cyber incident, a cybersecurity risk. We are really talking about a potential huge compliance impact, right? These applications support the finance of the company. These applications support HR processes. These applications support procurement, support a lot of different areas that we as organizations are enforced to provide controls and really be able to identify if there's unauthorized access or modification of that data. So all in all, we are talking about potentially a big compliance risk there. In terms of the follow-ups of this, we wanted to also not only make it as takeaways and really broad recommendations, but we wanted to make it very specific and very actionable as well. In terms of what you can do with this information, well, we have identified very specific timeframes of when threat actors have been exploiting these vulnerabilities. So please go back to the report and take a look at this. You have the timeframes there. If you have systems vulnerable to these problems during those timeframes, well, that's worth an analysis or a compromise assessment. More importantly, if those systems were internet facing. Now, if the systems were not exposed to the internet, the probability is a little bit lower, I would say, but still we have seen very similar patterns on attacks that happen at the internal network as well. So make sure that you're able to identify that and work with your teams to ensure that these systems are up to date and have not been compromised. I mentioned about the compliance impact. You have some references here of what it means. Depending on the information that is at risk, we are talking about different type of regulations: GDPR, CCPA, SOX, HIPAA, and PCI. So yeah, that really depends on the type of data. So closing on here, I wanted to thank everyone, especially the Optiv team, for having us here. We have a great partnership with Optiv and really work together in a number of different scenarios. I also wanted to thank Ignacio for his contributions and the demos that he did and the explanations that he provided. And I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference and that you have especially enjoyed this session. If you have any questions or follow-ups, I'm happy to address them. Feel free to reach out over social networks or any means. Happy to follow up. Thank you.